Welcome to Coast View, the show that every single day celebrates the men and women who are making coastal Mississippi such an amazing place to live, work, and play. Hey, you may not realize this. Maybe it popped up in your feed on Facebook, or maybe you read a story about it. But in April, we passed the 10-year anniversary of the oil spill. Obviously, that's not something we all want to remember, to be quite honest with you. It was a difficult aftermath that we had to deal with. I think we're in a better place today. And as I said to someone the other day, he said, how did BP do? And I said, well, I guess we'll know in 100 years, when we look back on all this. But for people who aren't aware of this, I was the publisher of the Press Register and president of a company that had responsibilities for other media companies, including Birmingham and Huntsville and other companies across the state of Alabama when the oil spill hit. And I was asked by Governor Bob Riley, to lead the oil recovery planning efforts for the state of Alabama. And he was about to leave office. A new governor was coming on. We had a lot of pomp and circumstance around doing the handoff of the plan, had over 1,000 people involved in that effort. And we modeled it much like we did the Governor's Commission on Recovery, Rebuilding, and Renewal here in coastal Mississippi. And in that process, I got to know some amazing people. I mean, I love Alabama. I love especially lower Alabama. Baldwin, by the way, Baldwin County, one of the largest counties in the entire United States. And as we all know, you go down south, and you have Gulf Shores and Orange Beach and Bon Secour, areas like that are very special. If I look at the people that I got to know and work with closely during that effort after the oil spill, one person really sticks out. And he's someone we're going to spend a whole show talking to today. We're going to learn a lot about the history of seafood here on the coast. We're going to learn a lot about oysters, and he's in a really unique position to understand sort of the state of affairs for oysters in our part of the country. But his name is Chris Nelson. He's the president of Bon Secour Fisheries in Baldwin County in Bon Secour, and he's a really good friend. So let me welcome you to Coast View, my friend.
Thanks, Ricky. Really honored to be here.
I mentioned to Mike and Anila Arguelles, who have the French Hermit Oyster Company. They're doing aquaculture. That during the oil spill, I got a chance to really appreciate what you do, and in particular what you do, because you in college you studied biology, you went on to get a marine science degree, and you gravitated toward the science side of things as it related to seafood, especially oysters. Oysters, I think there are some people who say that dolphins are sort of the canary in the landmine when you think about the health of an ecosystem like the Mississippi Sound. But actually, I can go, maybe one up them on that and say maybe oysters are in a better position to tell us the health of a fishery. But you really helped me understand that it's as much about science as it is about anything else, and I really appreciate you for that. I've carried that with me through the work that I've done since then, and particularly as it relates to this show. But we're gonna relive some of the steps. We're gonna talk about the challenge of the oil spill, certainly the opening of the Bonnet Carré Spillway and what that meant to your business. But let's take a step back for a second. Tell me about Bon Secour Fisheries.
Well, we're a family business. I'm fourth generation. My great grandfather got the family going in this business in the late 1890s, mid to late 1890s, and he started planting oysters. He married into a German family here locally that were oyster farmers, for lack of a better term. They called themselves planters because they would catch oysters in other parts of the bay, Mobile Bay, and plant them on leased bottom that they'd leased from the state of Alabama, grew oysters. He marketed those oysters in Mobile, and my grandfather did a very similar business. He was maybe even more extensive in the growing of the oysters. He had lots of plant beds up and down what we call the north and south shore of Bon Secour Bay. And then my father, after he came back from World War II, expanded the business into shrimping, and shrimp became really the big part of our business through the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And then when shrimping for us slowed down, we've come back around to doing still doing a good bit of processing of oysters. But we also are more and more into the distribution of seafood in general. And so we distribute seafood from the Gulf of Mexico, domestic waters, and quite a bit of imported seafood too that we are kind of forced to have to distribute because of the supply of seafood products is from the United States is restricted. And so we service primarily the southeastern U.S. We also distribute some into the Midwest and up in the Northeast as well. So that's Bon Secour Fisheries. We're a 130-year-old company trying to keep going. It's been a tough 20 years or so here. Since about 2000, we've had lots and lots of challenges.
A lot of challenges, man. I mean, you think about the world markets, the changes and the need to diversify and all of that. The way, as you pointed out very well, the change in domestic seafood, the need to really get into the importing business. you would have never, or in the early days, defined yourselves as a seafood distributor because you were in the seafood business and you were kind of local for the most part, and then you began to branch out. But when you say the Southeast, you've got trucks going all over the place every single day, don't you?
We do. We've got trucks going to pick up oysters in Louisiana and Texas, bring them back here to process, and then we have trucks going throughout the Southeast to deliver the product to other wholesalers as well as directly to restaurants. We really, speaking of the oil spill, the restaurant food service distribution business that we appreciate now locally, that was really important to us and has grown since the oil spill because a lot of areas interior to the country shied away from Gulf seafood for a while, as you well know, and that was a big part of our recovery effort, was to try to counter that, to try to respond to that consumer response to the images that they were seeing via the various media platforms regarding the oil spill. And so our local restaurants were big supporters because they wanted to have local seafood, and so there was a tremendous partnership built up between the seafood community and the hospitality industry here, and it remains. And so we do a lot of really good business with the local restaurants.
It is interesting, and there's so many ways we could have the conversation, but at a time when the oil spill happens and people are seeing those gooey images and all the challenges, et cetera, tar balls, washing up on the beach, et cetera. Mm-hmm. It is when you look across the coast states, certainly in Alabama, very, very coordinated effort to flip the script, literally, to put focus back on that it's safe, that it tastes good, that Gulf raised seafood is valuable. I think we effectively flipped that script, didn't we?
We did. We weren't alone in trying to fight that battle, but we played a big role in it. And I think we started a lot of important efforts. For instance, the Seafood Marketing Commission here in Alabama grew out of our efforts, and that remains an important source of information about Alabama seafood, which really can serve as a model for other Gulf of Mexico based seafood supply, and it's still a very important effort for the community.
I know it was one of our major recommendations, but the kind of energy that went into that, we were very aligned. Had a lot of science that proved that the seafood was safe. And it really gave you an opportunity to build relationships, like you pointed out, that continue to be leveraged today. I mean, it was a very trying time. There was a moment in time. I remember looking at you. I visited you down there, You were still processing oysters during that time. I remember all your people opening those oysters. I mean, there's you can't automate the opening of an oyster, can you, Chris?
Not yet. We continue to try. That's kind of a holy grail, one of the holy grails anyway in the oyster business, is to try to come up with an automated oyster shucking machine, but it hasn't been automated yet. It's because they're all so different in the shape and size and what have you. It's a natural product. It's different from, say, a potato or something that's grown that way.
I remember when I visited you early in the process after the oil spill and had a chance to see your operation. I think I met your father and your brother during that visit. And one of the things that hit me was, this is why we have to do what we're doing. This is why we have to have a plan. This is why we have to keep people focused on recovery. And a lot of it had to do with the marketing recovery as well. But it was a dynamic time. It was because of what I learned from you. It kept me kind of focused on trying to keep everybody together and focused on recovery. So when we come back, we can continue our conversation with my friend Chris Nelson, president of Bon Secour Fisheries. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to Coast View. We're having a conversation about Gulf seafood, and we just passed the 10-year anniversary of the oil spill, but there have been other challenges along the way, of course. Hurricane Katrina and other hurricanes, the algae bloom after the Bonnet spillway and opening, and all, there's always something going on. And now, of course, they had to deal with the pandemic, and now it'll be interesting to hear how sort of the supply chain shortages are affecting your business today. But let's just take a step back for a second. You literally grew up in the business, but I guess your parents were very focused on making sure you get a great education. Tell me about what you learned from them and the importance of education and how you've leveraged that in the work that you do today.
Well, my mother was a English teacher. She was a high school English teacher, so she was very focused on education. My father was as well. His father was not educated, and he valued, my father valued education probably based on watching his father struggle a little bit in business from a lack of education. And his he was largely self-educated, my father, but he knew a tremendous amount about accounting and business that he picked up along the way after his time in World War II in the Navy. And they both emphasized getting at least a college education. And I went on and got a master's degree in marine science, as you mentioned. My dad wanted me to get a PhD. I'm not sure what I would have done with it at Bon Secour Fisheries, because he also wanted me to come back and work in the business. But anyway, I never did get that.
But along the way, though, it's very interesting. What I liked about you is that you knew that you had to remain connected in the industry. So you were always, working as much outside of work to try to help push the seafood industry forward, to stay focused on regulation, on the science side of it. I mean, it's really, if you go back over the last, I don't know how long you've been literally doing this all your life now that we look back on it.
30 years since I got back in the business. Yeah.
I mean, it's been so dynamic. I mean, so many twists and turns. Mm-hmm. You've been able to maintain a good, strong business through it all. What keeps that going? Is it the family heritage, a love of the business? You just love business in general and wanting to be entrepreneurial and responsive to the market? What keeps you going?
We've got a lot of really good employees here, and we maintain a really good group, both in management and in the plant working. And it's, we try to promote a culture of, support for one another. It's because it's a family business. A lot of people tell me that it feels like family down here, which I think is good. I mean, it's a very good thing. It makes it tough from time to time because family is tough, but what it allows you to do is to lean on each other. And, that's what we did during the oil spill. We really had to do it during COVID. That was a very painful time, but it was. I think that's a big secret to our success has been the certainly the entrepreneurial spirit of my father and the support that my mother gave him gave us a really big push early on in the shrimp business. But then from that, the community itself appreciated having a place to work. I think the shrimp fleet that was in here appreciated having a steady market for their catch, and the community has supported us, and we've supported it over really over the last 50, 60 years tremendously, and that's been a big part of why we remain.
I remember I had this kind of very specific image in my head when you arrive at Bon Secour Fisheries. You have these beautiful, majestic oaks, and of course the docks back behind, and there were a couple of shrimp boats that were unloading when we were there. It just felt like literally a scene out of Forrest Gump. I mean, it was that kind of feel. Yeah. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has said that, but it's a very special place. Bon Secour is a very special place, isn't it?
It is. It is. The name of the community means safe harbor or good harbor in French, and in a lot of people's hearts, it's where a lot of people come back home, like I did, because it's where their moorings are, to take the analogy a little bit further. And so it is a very special place. It's getting a little crowded.
It's being discovered. That's what you mean. South
Baldwin County is. The traffic's getting a little challenging, but we love the area. It's a beautiful area.
It really is. Okay, so look, let's. You mentioned the pandemic. I can only imagine how difficult that was, because you run an operation where people sit close to one another, and then you had the issues of restaurants struggling and all of that. But coming out of the pandemic, what's sort of the state of affairs for you guys?
Well, we took the opportunity of the pandemic to really try to restructure a lot of what we did. It was extremely painful, and change is always painful. But it's been, I think in the long run, the experience will have been a good one for us in many ways. One thing it showed us is that we had an over-reliance on food service distribution and the restaurant pipeline to sell the seafood. We haven't really done a lot with that, but it's something we continue to look at and think about ways that we can exploit the retail side, direct to consumer. And a lot of seafood companies are doing that and seemingly being successful, but it's not something you can wave a wand and make happen. But we're making some progress in that direction to try to sell more direct to consumers, either through other retailers or out our own door.
Well, you mentioned, of course, oysters come from all over. You mentioned sort of regularly buy from Louisiana and Texas. How many points of I would say, points. I wanted to say distribution, but where you would pick it up. How many different pickup spots do you work with on a daily basis to determine where you're going to get your oysters?
Well, it depends on the season, and right now we're picking up primarily in Louisiana, because that's the only game in town for the most part until Texas opens its public reef season in November every year. November 1 is the opening of the public reef. Louisiana has not had a public reef fishery to speak of in a long time. They had a small opening this year in Sister Lake in west central Louisiana, Terrebonne Parish. But in Mississippi's public reefs have been woeful. Not picking on you, but I'm just saying it's been since Katrina. But after Katrina, there was a little bit of harvest in Mississippi. The oil spill seemed to draw it to a close, and then of course the Bonnie Carey spillway opening that you mentioned has kept Mississippi off the board as far as a source of oysters. So, and Alabama actually the last 3 years has had a pretty decent season, but our fishery is tiny. We're talking,
Yeah.
small boats with catching 6 bushels per person. But cumulatively, it was an important input. So, depending on the time of the year, we could be in Alabama, we could be across the bay here picking up oysters, we could be in Louisiana, we might be in Mississippi picking up from some people that are able to fish oysters in Louisiana, or all the way in South, really what I call South Texas, down close to Corpus Christi in the fall and early parts of the winter. We'll be picking up down there. So up and down the coast. Florida, I would love to say Florida would be in that mix, but Florida hasn't had much of an oyster fishery since Apalachicola closed down. So it's not an important source for us, but we would like to change that.
Kristen, when my wife Ann and I went to Croatia 3 years ago, I was blown away at the number of aquaculture operations all over that country, and beautiful, pristine water, cages they use that are up above, floating on top of the surface. But I mean, I'm talking about lots of them. So when, as a precursor to what you're beginning to see evolve now with aquaculture of oysters, I tell you what, we're coming to the end of this segment. When we come back on the other side, we'll talk about the evolution of aquaculture,
Okay.
and how it, is it beginning to really make an impact? I know it's still relative to the total number of sacks of oyster you get is probably very small, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's getting to be significant today. But when we come back, we're having a conversation with my friend Chris Nelson, who's the president of Bon Secour Fisheries in Lower Baldwin County in Bon Secour, and he has a real good sort of view across the entire Gulf states as it relates to what the state of affairs with seafood these days, especially given that we just celebrated, or you can't say really celebrated, the 10-year anniversary of the oil spill. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to Coast View. We're having a conversation with Chris Nelson, who's president of Bon Secour Fisheries in Baldwin, Alabama, someone I got to know really well back in the aftermath of the oil spill in Alabama. And he's in a really good position because he's doing business all throughout the Southeast, and he brings in oysters from coastal states across, the northern Gulf Coast. And it's just in a good position to sort of give us the state of affairs as it relates to the seafood industry these days. Hey, when we went to break, I mentioned about what I observed in Croatia and what we're seeing is burgeoning, small economy, but still burgeoning economy around aquaculture of oysters. How do you view that, and what's the future of that?
Oh, it's got a tremendous future. It's the next evolution of the oyster business along the Gulf Coast. It's got a lot of challenges to overcome, and I think it can ultimately fit in very well with the wild fishery as it supplies the market for oysters. The one thing that we haven't figured out, I say we as I keep referring to the oyster community, I'm talking about the industry, the academia that supports us, and the regulatory community that also is a big player here. We really haven't figured out how to integrate the aquaculture hatchery raised oyster. I'm going to use that as kind of a line that when you want to talk about aquacultured oysters along the Gulf Coast, or really in the United States, that's typically people are talking about starting with a seed oyster, a small oyster that's been reared in a hatchery first, because the guys in Louisiana and some leases in Texas as well grow oysters on bottom, but what they're doing is they're putting out culture material, hard material like a gravel or oyster shell itself. Used to put out clam shells that would provide a surface for the small oyster to attach to, and then provide some protection for that oyster while it was on the bottom, and they had access or exclusive access to that area to harvest the adult oyster when it matured. And so that's an extensive form of aquaculture, or mariculture, a lot of people would call that, but that's really considered a wild fishery in a lot of ways. So anyway, back to aquaculture, the hatchery reared product. If we can figure out how to support the oyster processing industry with aquaculture, I think it will fit in much more nicely. Now, the two industries, or the two sources of production, aquaculture and wild, are seen to be kind of going towards two completely different markets, and that's okay. That for now, the aquacultured product is more of a white tablecloth, fine dining, only going to be served on the half shell raw type product. The shell is usually smaller. The meats are often just as large, if not larger, than the wild oyster, but it doesn't lend itself to, say, what's become very popular, the char-grilled or char-broiled oyster, and it doesn't lend itself very well to oyster opening or shucking, to be able to provide oysters already shucked that would go into a stew, or fried oysters, oyster po' boy type preparation. So the people with the bottom leases and people that are growing them even off bottom have an opportunity to produce something that would still go into that processed oyster market with lower inputs of materials and labor, and to grow a larger oyster. So it takes longer to grow the oyster larger, and the aquaculture producers like to get the product out of the water and into the market to generate the cash flow that they need, but also to free up the space in their gear for their next crop of oysters. So I think over time we'll figure that out. The Chesapeake Bay has a similar industry that's gotten very big, and they're producing some oysters now that go into the processed oyster market to supplement their income with their high-end, often, have a boutique name. I mean, here locally we have Navy Cove, an Admiral Oyster Company. Here on this side of the bay, you've got Murder Points, and you've mentioned the French Hermits over in your neck of the woods. Those names are as saleable as the oysters are in many cases. You got a lot of sizzle with the steak, so to speak, when you've got that marketing of a particular name. But that's different from it's a new addition, and it's going to take a while to sort of have it all integrated into the overall oyster market.
Chris, you did a great job of differentiating how it's different once you get that finished product and how it ultimately gets to the market. I didn't really understand that differentiation very well, but I know Anita and Mike Arguelles really well. Mike's also in the pier business and built my pier, and I've known him for many years. His brother is a priest here in coastal Mississippi. But the French hermit oyster, what I remember about it is it tasted great, really, really good. And you're right. I mean, the shells may have seemed slightly smaller, but man, I remember a really meaty oyster. And it may be that they actually like it to be more medium size, so it's more of that delicacy or whatever. I'm not exactly sure how they look at that.
Yeah, one of the advantages that you have if you're going to use a hatchery seed is you can get a triploid oyster, meaning it's got 3 sets of chromosomes. Something that's going to reproduce. Humans to oysters have 2 sets of chromosomes. These oysters, being triploid, have 3 sets, and they don't reproduce. And so the energy that an oyster would spend, which is a tremendous amount of energy in the spring and summer, is spent by the animal to reproduce itself, doesn't happen. So it allows them to grow a little bit faster, but the bigger advantage is that meat stays firm throughout the year, as opposed to the cycle that you see with the wild oyster, or the natural oyster, the diploid oysters, is they get very, very firm and meaty, what we call fat. A lot of people talk about, the oysters are fat. There's not animal fat there. They're just fat in the shell. And then they lose that. That's converted over to gametes, reproductive material in the spring. and then the oysters spawn in the early summer, and then it takes them until November a lot of times around here to get fattened back up because the water is so warm. And so you obviate all that cycle whenever you're using triploid oysters.
So interesting. But see, there's the scientist in you talking about those differentiating factors. I recall Justin Wilson once saying that, the famous Cajun chef saying that he said, that oyster was so big, I had to swallow it twice. But it is interesting, man. I mean, depending on where the oysters come from, whether the water is clear or muddy, whether there's more rain or not. I mean, how many different genetic types of oysters are there?
Well, there are a lot of different, and that's a really good question. I don't think that science knows specifically how many, what you might say is a strain. We've gotten a lot of science has been thrown at us the last 24 months with studying viral science with the different strains of COVID, right? Well, with oysters, you have the same, not the same genetics, of course, but a similar situation where, how different are Mobile Bay oysters from oysters in Mississippi Sound over off Mississippi compared to oysters in Western Louisiana compared to oysters in Texas or Florida. And I don't think we really have the answer to that. And then furthermore, if they're different, so what? Does it matter if you move them around a lot? Because that's the big fear is, someone over in Florida, well, if you're going to, particularly with this aquaculture opportunity, if you're going to have aquaculture seed come from a hatchery in Alabama, and you're in Florida, do they need to be worried about bringing in genetics from the local oyster in Alabama into their more local ecosystem in say the Panhandle over around Apalachicola Bay? A lot of ecologists would say, yeah, that's definitely something we need to be concerned with, and I think rightfully so. They're very conservative about it, and so the genetics for the local area is often they want to conserve that and have oysters put in the environment that are of the same or similar genetic strain as the oysters that were there traditionally. And so that is a concern. But they all, in general, to answer your question here, I'm giving you the long-winded Dr. Fauci answer here, but the real answer is oysters from Texas to Maine are all the same species, and that's what's really important because species are what define whether or not something can interbreed. You need to stop me.
Yeah, let's do this. We'll pick it up on the other side. We're having a conversation with Chris Nelson, the president of Bon Secour Fisheries in Lower Baldwin County, Alabama, who has a good sort of overview of the entire Gulf. When we come back, we'll enjoy a final segment together. We'll see you after this break. Back to my friend Chris Nelson, who I got to know really well when I was working over in Alabama. So one of my favorite people, his family, and what they mean to the lower portions of Alabama. I can't overstate how important they are. It's great to see a generational commitment to a business like they have. And we're talking about oysters right now. When we went to break, you were talking about the species of oysters, whether it be Maine or Texas. It's the same, but they can be very different tasting, can't they?
Absolutely, and that's become a big driver of the aquaculture industry in establishing a name for your oyster that's often attached to where it's grown. Like the French hermit is grown off Mississippi on outside of your outer banks, so to speak, your barrier islands, and that oyster is going to taste different from an oyster in Alabama, which will taste different from an oyster over around Apalachicola, which will be different from, say, a North Carolina or a Maine or a Massachusetts oyster. And that is being sold as a big part of why you want to carry oysters if you're a restaurant from all these different areas, similar to wines. And in fact, there was even a term that's been coined. I don't particularly like it, but is being thrown around merroir, which is similar to the terroir that you talk about with wines, and merroir would be the in this case the oyster having the characteristics of the water that it's grown in, and that's really what it is. It's the salinity and mineral content of the water.
And they can be so different. One of our favorite restaurants when we travel, we go to Key West pretty regularly, and there's a restaurant there that every afternoon, late, early evening, has a kind of a special, and they specialize in different oysters from different regions of the country. So when they put them in front of you, it depends on what's available. Will depend upon what they put in front of you. But they might have one from Chesapeake, one from Maine, one from somewhere in Florida, some from the Gulf. And when they put them in front of you, it's amazing to me. They're all fine, but it always seems that the Gulf oyster is better. Maybe that's just my experience, but it's just multiple times experiencing the same experience. Do you tend to have a tendency to lean toward the Gulf oyster more?
I do, and actually, the one thing I'll caution you, in my mind, there is no such thing as a Gulf oyster, although a lot of people refer to it as that, Ricky. It's a Gulf Coast oyster, and the Atlantic coast or the East Coast has lots of different bays. The Gulf has all those different bays and bayous and inlets where oysters are grown, even naturally. And our oyster is often a little milder in flavor. You can get some, because the oyster grows very, very fast. So you're eating a younger oyster, typically off the Gulf Coast. On the East Coast, you've got product that's taking 2 to 3 years at least to get to maturity. A lot of these aquaculture oysters, particularly if they're grown off bottom along the Gulf Coast, they're reaching maturity in 18 months. And so you've got a very young oyster with a relatively thin and smaller shell, but it does have a milder flavor. A big deal is made out of the salt content. And so Gulf oysters are a lot of times thought of as not being as salty, oysters off the Gulf Coast, because we have a lot of freshwater input. You think about it. I mean, we've got, the riverine systems in Alabama, the Mississippi River, huge input of fresh water. You got to go over to Texas or Florida to get away from really the fresh water. And on the East Coast, you've got Chesapeake Bay and you've got some other systems, but more where because of the population near the coast, you've got a lot of potential pollution sources. So they almost have to get out in the Atlantic Ocean to grow their oysters. And so they're often very, very salty, like the Atlantic Ocean.
That's so interesting to me. And you're right. Freshwater, as we got too much of an education about freshwater when the Bonnie Carey Spillway opened, but some freshwater is not a bad thing, actually. Finding that sweet spot between freshwater and saltwater. Oysters kind of thrive in that kind of environment, don't they?
Oysters are the prototypical estuarine animal, and an estuary is where the rivers and the bays meet the ocean, right? And so the bays and bay systems are the estuaries, and oysters are genetically adapted to being able to survive the changes in salinity and that mixture. A lot of people refer to it as brackish water, but it's estuarine salinity between full oceanic strength and full freshwater. And so, if oysters are going to grow where they naturally would have grown, they're going to vary in how much salt they've got in them, depending on how much rainfall there's been. And that's challenging from time to time.
I know that it can be. Hey, listen, man, we could spend another show just talking about all this stuff. It's fascinating to me, and you know what you're talking about. That's why I wanted you on the show. From time to time, we'll have you back. I'm sorry it's taken so long to get you on, Chris. I think the world of you, and you're one of the good guys, and I hope you and your family continue to have a good run of it, my friend.
Thanks, Ricky. Great to see you.
It's been a pleasure. This has been Chris Nelson from Bon Secour Fisheries, and have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.